Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 28 of the ITSM crowd. Today we're joined by author Randy Steinberg, and we're going to talk about Randy's new book, which is High Velocity IT Service Management. So first of all, I'm going to ask Randy to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about his background, please.
Hi, Claire. Thanks. Yeah, essentially, I've been a consultant here in the IT service management space, specifically in service management for almost 20 years now, in IT operations and support for well over 30 years at this point. And just specialize in ITIL, in IT service management. I work all the time with clients, hands-on, so I try to stay real, as I call it, with whatever solutions we provide, and certainly have tried to provide a lot of material in the form of books and other things to practitioners and others that are still working in this particular space.
Fantastic, thank you. My name's Claire Agata. I'm the lead tutor for ITSM Zone, and I'm the host of today's session. We will be answering any questions you might have. If you want to put any questions onto Twitter, we'll be following the hashtag ITSM crowd. So if you've got any questions that you want to put to Randy, pop them on Twitter with the hashtag ITSM crowd, and we'll pick them up live and answer them during our discussion. So you've written quite a few books, Randy. Maybe you can kind of talk us through the progression of what you've written.
Certainly. The reason I write the books and the target audience I'm looking for when
What's the future in a digital world? And your book was one of the books that he put up there as a reading reference. So it's definitely catching people's attention. So your previous books were more traditional IT service management, and this one maybe moves into new areas. What sort of knowledge do people get from the book? How can they use it?
The number one basic thing, I think the takeaway here is, where does IT service management fit in with all of this stuff? And I very strongly believe that the need for a service management approach is more acute than ever before, because all of these disciplines, DevOps, Agile, virtualization, convergence, all those things, there are some very good suggestions and practices and some really good evolution of how IT is building and developing solutions as they go out there. I think, though, however, they're also going off in their own narrow directions, and that's where there's a lot of confusion. So I look at IT service management as the glue and the cement for how all of those things are going to plug into what you do. It still comes down to the basics of, I'm delivering an IT service. The only thing that's changing here is how that service is actually getting developed and how it's actually being delivered.
Yeah, and do you think maybe we're a bit too quick in service management to run after new trends?
I don't think you're ever too quick, because the world is changing. The delivery model, the emergence of cloud. I mean, a good example right now is, if you're a software development company and you're producing solutions of all different kinds and types, at this point, the cloud right now is probably your #1 channel for how you're going to deliver and manage your solution. The days of producing software disks and then mailing them out and then having people manually install them on infrastructure that they have to manage and maintain in their own IT organization, I think there's some radical change happening with that. It's more cost effective to go up into the cloud. Yes, there are some things to try to nail down with that, and it's still in its early stages, but the big movement seems to be there. A good example I'll use is just Microsoft, for example, with their entire product set. They are rapidly trying to push things into the cloud because they don't want to deal with sending out software and disks and downloads and all kinds of stuff. They would just rather have you hook into their service and basically use that service. And the other piece to that is their service remains, you may have heard a term called evergreen, which means that when you do access that service, it is always on the latest release, always with the latest patch updates. And that's a benefit not only for you as a user, It's also a benefit for the software vendor because essentially they don't have to manage and maintain these different releases and patches and all the headaches that come with that. So there's really a win-win on both sides, which is why I think that's a trend that's going to continue. And you see other vendors kind of moving in that same direction. It hasn't really changed at all. And there are also new challenges with that. I get into clients a lot, and they're a little nervous about the evergreen being, well, gee, if the vendor's constantly adding patches and updates under that, how does that work with our change management? Some vendors, some clients have issues with, I know here in the U.S., for example, one example is a pharmaceutical company, and they do and have to do rigorous FDA testing before things can be released, and that includes making sure all the systems are adequately vetted and there's no issues. And there's also always a scare with, hey, I might be doing something on a spreadsheet, but if the tolerance is, down, because I'm tracking things down to 9 different digit levels, if the tolerances change, I'm in trouble with that. So there's all those concerns that are out there. Again, this is kind of new challenges with that environment, but I think people will get over that as time goes on. But what's interesting is challenges like that are actually forcing the need to try to look at things like lean IT and Agile and others with the concern that the industry is moving very fast. Changes are coming more and more. And there needs to be a way to operate in a way that we can operate much faster and much leaner. And so the book essentially was a way to try to highlight what the nature of the industry is and talk about these different disciplines like DevOps and Agile and virtualization, and what do those mean from an ITSM perspective? What are those? Because sometimes people don't understand. And then switch over to what are techniques and steps you can maybe relook at your ITSM processes and find ways to try to automate and lean some of those out in different ways to try to operate much faster and more efficiently. So.
Yeah, I mean, some of the companies that I talk to, they are a bit overwhelmed, I would say, because there is lean, there's agile, there's DevOps, and they are kind of, where do I start? What should we be doing? Should we be doing DevOps? Should we be doing Agile? Is that something that the book kind of helps them out with? Just what the first steps should be?
It helps them, look at what each one is and ways that they can use some of this stuff to kind of move forward with. Some of this stuff I think you might do ahead of others. I would look at lean IT as a way of starting. Which is go back, look at your services that you deliver or your processes that you're using, and maybe start there and say, is there a way we can deliver these faster, cheaper, more quickly, and gain some efficiencies from what's there? That's where I would start, and then I would spin off efforts to kind of address that. Things like Agile, right now Agile is mostly for developers. They're the ones that are using it the most. I think you can apply Agile-like concepts also to service management and development of infrastructure projects. For example, and I have an example actually in the book where I took an asset management implementation effort and I said, how might you do that in 22 sprints essentially for getting that into place? And you can do that. For example, I can have successes where I just simply put up software, and maybe I just put up screens with fields on them, no data behind them, but just screens and fields. And then I have a demo session where I'll sit down key users and we'll walk through those flows and those screens and basically get some immediate feedback that we could then apply to a next round that we're going to show them. And then build in some of the backgrounds and the data and the things that happen in addition to that. So I think you can do infrastructure projects as well using Agile-like concepts, and it's just a matter of thinking and working just a little bit differently than the traditional big bang that we used to do in the past. For things like DevOps, that's going to require a big change. Working with developers, I always joke developers don't really understand operations. Likewise, operations doesn't understand development. But there are some things you can do in the short term with that. One is I could take my operations products and services and I make sure I kind of put service bundles around that and offer those to developers. And again, the book gives you some examples of maybe the kinds of services that the developers would say, hey, this is really helpful to have, where that can start the conversation. The other thing there is, and I found this a lot, is even if you just throw people together, so and I've seen this happen at some companies, they'll throw the developers in with the operations people and put them in a room and hope something happens out of that. and that happens more than you think. And the challenge there is, again, the developers don't understand operations, so they're not sure how to work with ops. And on the other side, I don't think operations understands development and the right questions to ask at the right time. So, I've been in meetings where basically development might be in some kind of logical database design in terms of an early effort of where they're at in their design stage. And the operations people are sitting there trying to, well, can you tell me how much network bandwidth you're going to use and the number of sites? And they're not ready to answer those questions. So again, they throw you out of the room and say, come back later when we're ready. But there are some key questions at various points in the development life cycle that you can ask. If they're at the very beginning level, I mean, there's lots of questions around how this is going to be delivered. Are you going to be using delivery partners? All the things you would do in service strategy. You can almost mirror the ITSM lifecycle stages and use that as a guide for questions. And the book does give you some guidance in terms of the kinds of questions you might ask at each stage to try to help some of that out. So I'll give you one example where you can provide value just to show how that whole DevOps thing works a little bit, which is where I had a very large client with a major hundreds of millions of dollars U.S. investment to try to build a major system. And essentially they got the development team got stalled for about 3 months arguing, do I put a fat or thin client out at a particular location for this? And I just happened to be in the room and we're just talking a little bit and I started asking support questions like, what happens if a disk drive breaks? And of course the development response, well, that's ops stuff, why are we even talking about that? And I had to slow them down and say, well, if you have a fat client out at those remote sites and a disk drive breaks, what's going to happen, the repair guy comes in and he fixes the disk and then he closes the bay door and he's out the door. Is that good enough for you guys? And they're like, well, what do you mean? And I go, well, if it's a fat client, you have all kinds of things, right? I usually have data recovery routines and scripts I've got to run to get back up. And this guy's not going to do that, and you don't have skills at that site. And then they would say, well, then you got to get a smarter repair guy. Well, they don't come that way. So now I have to get 2 people. Now I've got dispatch and coordination issues. And how quick do you need them there? They said 3.5 hours. Well, most people won't come out under 4 hours and guarantee, at least here in the U.S. So when we started going through all that, to put the right kind of support in for that became very, very expensive. And then when we started talking about, well, how many remote locations now are you talking about? They said they had 22,500 locations just in the U.S. alone, let alone internationally. So the expenses, and when you multiply it out, it would have cost them more to support this than at least 3 times what they were spending to build it. Yeah. So that became untenable. And then somebody said, well, what if we put a thin client out there? And I said, well, then he just puts the disk in the door, closes it up, you power the machine on, and you're done. And so that settled a development question that they were arguing about for months, just because they understood now the full operational picture. And I point that out as a good example of a DevOps collaboration, because I think that's where we want everything to get to. But back to your original point, there may be challenges there with the culture of your organization, even getting management to agree to have both sides in the room throughout the entire development stage, not just at the end of it. And then also the skills of the operations people to kind of understand the right things to ask at the right time. So there's some things to overcome, but I think the concept's a good one. We're on the early stages of that, and I think some maturity will happen over time with that.
Yeah, it's interesting because we spent so long talking about IT and the business speaking different languages, but then if we look within IT, you've got developers, you've got operations, I was at a DevOps event recently, and there was someone saying we've got Dev and Ops working together now, but we've got this security team that's on one side and they're not talking to us. So it's those relationships within IT that are essential as well. So for kind of a traditional service management person, then somebody who's maybe got some ITIL certificates, what should they be doing now to ready themselves for the future, apart from reading the
think,
book?
yeah. I mean, I think you just initially want to understand what these different approaches, i.e., Agile, DevOps, cloud computing, lean IT, if you haven't looked at that before, just understand what those things are saying out right now today, and get a good handle on what they provide in terms of value as you go forward. And it's interesting as you read through some of that. Some of them have, for whatever reason, either not looked at service management or shunned away from it. And I've been in various workshops where things, I think there was a form, I won't say the methodology, but there was a form of Agile Scrum that was being presented by a leading expert in that area. And I'm just painfully watching the complexities of that being presented, because they never bring up the concept of a service. So they start inventing all kinds of different entities to get around that, and it becomes more confusing, and I can see people in the workshop are getting confused. But I think as you look at that stuff, you may start to see, oh, hey, if I just did it this way versus that way, these are ways that we could make it kind of operate much better and provide a lot more value. But I would start out by at least understanding what those things are, and then maybe pick a pilot project that you can maybe apply some of this in terms of how you want to operate and go forward with. I think ultimately you will be picking and choosing the different aspects of many of these new movements that are coming in to help deliver and build services and support them over time. There's not one item or one particular area that has all the answers. So it's not let's all do DevOps, for example, or let's all do Agile. But I think it'll be kind of picking and choosing the best that each one of those has to offer based on the kinds of services and things that you're building.
So did you expect to see a much more disparate approach to service management in future? Because I think if we look back 10 years, you had companies that said, oh, we do ITIL, and that was pretty much it, and the developers were working in some other way. Do you see the future as being, we'll take something from ITIL, something from DevOps, something from Lean, and kind of create our own practices based on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, ITIL, it's just guidance. There was never meant to be you must, do every step of the way here. But it's interesting because ITIL purposely shunned step-by-step directed approaches to solutions. I know that frustrates some people, but ITIL focused kind of on the what you need to do, not necessarily so much on the how it's going to get done. When ITIL says, for example, you need to log all changes and you need to have them approved and you need to do impact analysis, I don't think any of that what ever changes. You still need to do that. ITIL never said, well, that means you have to have, long overhead processes and lots of overview and approvals. I think one thing that shocked me is one of the catalysts for writing the book, especially the lean portion, was the average change management turnaround for most companies is anywhere from 9 to 22 business days.
Wow.
And that was done in a study. I've got it in the book. And I spent a lot of time just on change management, just saying, here's some creative ways to get through that. ITIL never said you should spend that much time doing change management. It just says you need to provide A, B, and C. It didn't say how you need to do that. So that's a good example of where you might take a look at some of your processes and say, well, gee, maybe there's some alternative ways that we can kind of do those differently. But as you look at these different things, I wouldn't lose sight of, are there some key issues, services, processes that are just aggravating everybody in the organization? They're too slow, they're not moving fast enough, and maybe pick one of those as a pilot.
Mm-hmm.
and then apply all these concepts, because I think they all work together eventually as you go forward with that. And again, the book provides a little bit of guidance in terms of how you might look at that and how you might look at different processes to do this. There's things that are in there that when you want to lean out a process, for example, talk about something called the 8 Deadly Waste tool, and there's a lot of attention to using that as a framework where I'll, once I map out my process, let me look at each of the steps in the light of each of the deadly wastes, and see if I can ferret out some things that are there. Maybe I'm producing more than I need to, for example, or maybe I'm misusing people, or I've got too much. I'm taking things out of one system and transcribing them to go into another system, and that's happening manually, and things like that. That maybe there's better ways to try to handle that. There's also, some of there's 4 strategies for how you might take any process to look at it. One example is, can I take out any tasks that really are not providing value?
Yes.
So re-looking at those, if they're not providing value, let's get rid of those steps. There's another one where maybe I can combine steps into a single step, or I can move some steps into the background and run in parallel versus serial. One example, I had a large insurance company where they had just simple software procurement where users could download software, and it took weeks and weeks, and when you analyzed it out, they were just, a lot of that time was spent waiting for approvals. So somebody said, well, why don't we just grant them the software automatically? Let's run the approval process in parallel, and if it's discovered that they are not really authorized to get it, then we'll just cancel their subscription or whatever. But that way the user gets the software almost immediately. So that's one example, again, of using some of these things and these ideas that are in there, those are all things that hopefully provide some help and how you might look at things. To me, it's a little bit exciting because it's kind of a chance to relook at your processes, relook at ITSM. You're really not changing the goals and what you're trying to do with ITSM. You're just saying maybe there's a more efficient or faster way that we can operate.
Yeah, and I think just kind of coming back to that example about the software procurement, because to a certain extent, from a business perspective, they don't really care, if you're doing ITIL or DevOps or Lean or whatever it might be. But for the businesses that are starting to work in this way, what sort of benefits should they expect to see?
The biggest benefit to the business is hopefully that IT is moving much faster, providing solutions much faster than maybe the way that they're being delivered today. There may be cost reductions that they might see just because more things are being done efficiently. I don't know if you're going to see cost reductions in terms of like headcount reduction. Is because really what happens if you're truly operating this way, what's happening is really more changes are coming in faster and faster. So you're still keeping the head count, they're just doing much more with the head count they have than they've done before. But the business would see that certainly from a DevOps perspective, and I've been harping on this for decades. Something like this is essentially solutions that go into place and hopefully operate and work correctly the first time without causing a lot of organizational churn and a lot of outages that were unplanned for. And most importantly, where they don't get blindsided by ongoing operational costs, because you see that a lot. I think there's a lot of value there. I see a lot of this as the industry is moving this way. It's going to move this way whether we want it to or not. And this is a way to cope with this. I think we're at a tipping point where you have to look at all your processes, the way you operate, and start to seriously ask: is there alternative ways, more efficient ways that we can deliver on this stuff?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So we're coming to the end of our time now. So where can people get the book from? Where's it available?
It should be on Amazon.com now, and it's available in ebook as well as just normal size books, as I call them. and then Trafford Press also is. It's the site I go through, but they publish out through Amazon and other locations as well.
Yeah, I have to confess, I've got a Kindle. I like ebooks, but certainly for work things, it's nice to have something that you can draw on with a highlighter and put sticky notes in as well. So I like a paper copy of a book for things like that.
Right, and you can also lend it to others. So it's
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's very liberal of you as the author as well. We don't all have to have our own copy. Okay, any final tips that you want to share with people before we wrap up?
No, other than, again, we're in the early stages with a lot of this stuff. A lot of these things, I think, again, are very good ideas. I think DevOps is a great concept, as well as Agile, as well as Lean IT. And I think it's, again, just recognizing that service management can be the glue to hold all this stuff together, because it is going off in disparate directions.
Mm-hmm.
And basically get familiar with the concepts and start to look at how things can be done, and really take a serious look at the way you operate today, and look for good opportunities where you can operate much leaner and faster. And again, look for low-hanging fruit. Don't focus a lot of time on little improvements. It's really going to be some things where there are major headaches. You'd see a lot of value if you're able to get some of that in place.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. Thank you very much for your time today, Randy. Really appreciate that. And High Velocity IT Service Management, very much recommended reading for anybody who wants to get an introduction to these areas. So thank you, Randy.
Okay, certainly.